So the other day I was watching an old Erik Ten Hag interview on Ajax TV, and the interviewer was showing him a clip of an Ajax game in the Champions League run from 2018-19. And Erik Ten Hag loved this clip because in that clip, all of the players on the field for Ajax were involved in generating a chance, even the players who didn't touch the ball. And one player in particular stood out, and that was Donny van de Beek. And this is what Erik Ten Hag had to say about Donny van de Beek's role in this chance creation. So he says, "Look at Donny there, keeping it wide. Minimum width, we call it, to lure the defender and create space, creating space to execute team play." But what does Erik Ten Hag mean by minimum width? Well, in order to talk about minimum width, we need to talk about maximum width. And we actually talk about maximum width quite a lot on this channel because we often talk about positional play. Now, when we talk about positional play, often we will start drawing these lines on the pitch, dividing the pitch into these 5 channels. So we have a central space, 2 half spaces, and 2 wide spaces. So why might these 5 channels be so important? Well, if you're playing against a team with a back 4, these 5 channels should match up to the gaps between their back line. And what you'll see a positional play team trying to do in the attacking phase is get players into these channels so that they can exploit those spaces between the opposition players here. But already here we can see one of the downsides of this maximum width approach, because by spreading your players across the whole width of the pitch, what you're actually doing is you're increasing the spaces between your players. And this is an issue because the further apart the players are, the harder it is for them to interact with one another. Now, a really good example of this is the concept of overload to isolate, and a lot of positional teams will use this. The idea being that you get a lot of your players in the attacking phase around the ball. This makes it easier to keep the ball away from the opponent, but you also keep one player isolated on the other side. And the general idea is that by keeping the ball on this side, what you're going to do is you're going to attract the opposition defense over, and this player then is going to become really isolated. But the problem here is that with your players and the ball over on this side, even if you do manage to make this crossfield pass to the isolated player, because that's such a long pass, it takes a lot of time, so the opposition can shift across into a better defensive situation, and this player is by definition isolated, and so again you still have a lot of gaps between this player on the ball and the rest of his teammates. And what you're doing then is you're not relying on team play here, you're simply relying on the individual brilliance of this player to try and generate something. And that's exactly why Erik Ten Hag is interested in the concept of minimum width, because he's still concerned with generating space in the opposition's back line. But rather than doing that by using the maximum width possible, he's actually going to do it by using the minimum width necessary. This is exactly what minimum width is. And so by implementing the idea of minimum width, we've already started to solve the problem of the gaps between players. So this is minimum width here. We can see there's a short distance between the interior here and the wide player, whereas in the concept of maximum width, you have all of this space between the wide player and the inside players. But there's an additional benefit here, and that is that when you play with minimum width, your wide player is much closer to the goal than the wide player when you're playing with maximum width. What does this mean? Well, when using minimum width, in this instance, the fullback has a decision to make. They can either push forward onto the ball carrier, in which case the ball carrier can actually play the ball into the feet of the wide player, who has a really direct route to goal. Alternatively, the fullback could push across onto the wide player and leave space for the ball carrier to attack in the box. But over on the other side, because of the increased distances, both in terms of the pass to the wide player and the wide player's route to goal, it just gives much more time for the opposition to restructure themselves and make it much harder for the attacking team to actually generate a dangerous chance. And that brings us to the clip that Erik Ten Hag was talking about in his Ajax TV interview. So this is a game between Juventus and Ajax in the Champions League. The ball's going to be built up down the far side of the field. We've got Donny van de Beek here, who is the player that Erik Ten Hag is so interested in. And as we can see, he's already on a very, very narrow line here, just outside the line of the centre circle here, and he's still outside the line of the fullback over on this side as well. So this is Donny van de Beek using the concept of minimum width. But then if we move the clip on, we can see that Donny van de Beek is able to push into that front line. He's able to attract the fullback from Juventus across, generating space between the centre-back and the fullback for Juventus, and creating plenty of space for his teammates to actually exploit. So that by the time the ball arrives at the edge of the box, we can see that van de Beek has created the space for that shot to be taken, but also the possibility exists for a pass into van de Beek's feet, and he has a really dangerous route to goal there. And we're also seeing this concept of minimum width being used at Erik Ten Hag's Manchester United as well. So here's a screenshot from the recent Leicester game that Manchester United played, and we can see again Marcus Rashford, the wide player here, using a concept of minimum width, pulling Castagna across, generating space between the centre-back and the full-back, and giving space for Luke Shaw to actually attack as well. So we're seeing those ideas being played at Manchester United as well now. But there are other benefits to using the concept of minimum width, one of which comes when you look at counter pressing. So again, let's take this instance where we've got minimum width over here. Let's say that this ball is lost, both of these players are close enough to the ball carrier now to be able to counter-press really quickly. Over on the other side, where we've got a concept of maximum width at play, again, if the ball is lost here, then the gaps between these two players and the ball carrier is much bigger. So again, minimum width gives you a benefit in terms of counter-pressing. And then a final example of the benefits of minimum width comes when we think about counter-attacking. This is really important for Erik ten Hag's Manchester United because they are a team who are really dangerous at counter-attacking. So let's imagine that the opposition team are in their build-up phase. So what they're going to do is they're going to spread their back line apart to possess the ball better, to move it down the field. But let's imagine that they turn the ball over. So now the team who were defending are now in a counter-attacking situation. And we have the same situation with proximity to goal because the team who are minimally wide have a much more direct route to goal. They can also do that route a lot quicker than the team who are maximally wide. And when you're counter-attacking, speed is of the essence. Now I have a couple of examples of this again. Now this is a clip from the Manchester derby. Actually, we've got Manchester City in possession of the ball here. And what's going to happen is Bernardo Silva playing a pass to Rodri, but actually overplays the pass and it's going to be intercepted by Marcus Rashford here. Now we're talking about the outer possession phase for Manchester United here, and it's really interesting to see how narrow Marcus Rashford is here. And that is because Erik ten Hag likes his wingers to sit between the opposition fullback and centre-back in actually quite a narrow configuration. And this achieves two things. The first thing is that he can jump onto this interception really quickly, but also he's really nicely positioned to then counter-attack from here. And we see the same is true from Bruno Fernandes, who's playing on the right this time, and he's between the fullback and the centre-back as well. So when Rashford picks the ball up here, plays the ball to Christian Eriksen, and as we can see, Bruno Fernandes on a really narrow configuration here, so he's got a really dangerous route to goal. So Manchester United have really benefited from their wingers being in quite a narrow configuration. They're able to win the ball back, but also actually spring these really dangerous counter-attacks as well. I've got another example of this happening in the game versus Barcelona. Now in this instance, Casemiro has the ball. He actually plays the ball into this defender here, who picks the ball up, and then Manchester United are going to counter-press and win it back. But we can see here Bruno Fernandes, who's playing on the right here, in a really minimally wide position. You can see he's just wide of the centre circle. So he's already looking for that ball into that dangerous half-space channel here. And what happens is that actually Casemiro wins the ball back. And we can see that Bruno Fernandes then is well in advance of his fullback, so that when Casemiro wins the ball back and actually play that pass, when Bruno Fernandes receives that ball, he's in a much narrower position than he might have been if he was playing wider. And again, that just gives him a really dangerous route to goal as well. Having experienced Pep Guardiola in the Premier League across the last few seasons, we're all very adept at the concept of maximum width and how it can be used to get advantages on a football field. But with Erik ten Hag arriving in England, we're starting to develop a much broader understanding of how width can be used on a football field.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.